Tradition suggests, and common courtesy requires, that a speaker begin by telling you how happy he is to be with you tonight. It is a joy to say this, and for once, really, to mean it. I've gone across this country 100 lectures in 45 states in the last 9 months, and I have seen America awakening. And therefore, when I come to your community, I can say it really is a pleasure to be with you at this exciting moment. And this may well be the last pleasant thing that I have to say to you. For there is nothing pleasurable about the tragic, cruel, illegal, immoral, and un-American war that we have been fighting in Vietnam. I fought for my country in World War II. Was very proud to. I supported my country in the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and NATO and in the war in Korea. A dove is properly the symbol of a pacifist. Perhaps I lack the moral courage to be a pacifist, but in any case, I'm not. And so when I oppose the war in Vietnam, it is not for reasons of pacifism or for being a dove. It is because, as a free man with a free mind, with 22 years' experience in Vietnam and as a student of the affair, I'm convinced the war is wrong. And I would like to ask all of you to come with me and walk down the paths of history that I've walked down, to share with me the research and study that I have done, and then to reach your own conclusions based upon knowledge. I have not come here, truly, to persuade anybody of anything. That would be very presumptuous of me. I have come to open the record, and to say to you also, don't believe me, check me up. I'll indicate the source material, the documents and the books, where you can find for yourself what the facts are. Don't believe me and don't believe Rusk, although I am considerably more trustworthy and reliable. Let us see if we can answer together the questions that all Americans are asking each other with increasing agony these days. How in the world did we ever get into this thing in the first place? Where did it all begin? Where are we now? And how can we get out? For me, the beginning took place a very long time ago, back in 1944, when I was a young intelligence officer on the staff of General Eisenhower. And flipping through intelligence reports one day, I saw that some colleagues of mine, Colonel Gallagher, Major Petty, and others, had been sent to a country I'd never heard of or thought of, called Vietnam, to make contact with a great patriot who was fighting for the freedom of his country and who was our ally in the war against Japan. I'll give you one guess, and one guess only, as to the name of this great patriot, our ally. Yes, it was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, who today is pictured as a servant of international communism and an enemy of the United States of America. What has happened in a quarter of a century to turn this man from ally and a patriot into an enemy? Well, I first met Ho Chi Minh in Paris in the summer of 1946. I last met him in Hanoi this past summer, 1967. And I must tell you that Ho Chi Minh has not changed in any way at all. He is today what he was when we first sent our men to meet him. He is a communist, has been a communist almost all of his life. I remember asking him in Paris, how did you become a communist? And he said to me, well, I left home when I was a young boy, about 18, just a few steps ahead of the French police. I signed on as a kitchen boy in a merchant marine ship for a trip around the world. He said, I stopped off in New York and in Boston for a while, and I went around telling people about my country and how we wanted to be free, and nobody was interested. He said, back then in 1914-15, you were involved in another one of your Mexican incidents, and nobody cared about Vietnam. He said, I went to London and stopped off there for a while and got a job in the kitchen of the Carlton Hotel. That was the time when the great chef Escoffier was running the kitchens, which has led to the legend that Ho Chi Minh is a great gourmet. Well, if scrubbing dishes in Escoffier's kitchen can make you a great gourmet, I guess there's a lot of them in the world. But he said he went all around London, but London was the heart of empire, and there he couldn't get a hearing either. He then went to Paris, and in Paris for the first time he met some men who were willing to listen to him. They were members of the French Socialist Party, and they talked to him about the brotherhood of man and socialism, and he began to study, and he became a member of the French Socialist Party and named as one of their colonial delegates. And then the war ended. Germany was defeated, and the great men of the world came to Paris. And Ho Chi Minh said to me, I stood and I cheered with hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen, and tears ran down our eyes as the patron saint of freedom, Woodrow Wilson, drove down the Champs-Élysées. And as a colonial delegate of the Socialist Party, I rushed out to the Versailles Conference and gave a petition to Woodrow Wilson and said, your 14 points are wonderful. We want an evolution towards freedom in my country. And he said, Woodrow Wilson didn't answer me. He said, I'm sure my petition was never given to him. I came back to my meeting heartbroken. I thought nowhere in the world would anybody listen to me and the yearning for freedom of my country. And I wondered whether or not you all thought that freedom was a monopoly for white Western and Christian peoples. And we, the colored Asian peoples of the world, were to be the slaves. And one of my socialist friends said to me, take heart. Why don't you write to Moscow? There's a man there named Lenin. Maybe he will listen to you. And Ho Chi Minh wrote to Lenin, and Lenin wrote back and said, certainly, do come to Moscow. Ho Chi Minh worked on for a while in the French Socialist Party, and then when it split in 1920, the Congress of Tours into two new parties. One, the socialist faction of the Second International, and a new party, just born, the Communist Party of France. And Ho Chi Minh, the Annamite, became a founding member of the French Communist Party, and then went on to a new university just opened up in Moscow called the University of the Toilers of the East. And that, he said, is where I did my postgraduate work in communism. Things might have been otherwise, he said, had Woodrow Wilson answered me and invited me to Washington. But the only people who listened and the only people who cared were communists. And he said, I hope you Westerners learn a lesson from this. And this is what he told me in 1946. And alas, the lesson was not learned. Ho Chi Minh, like many other peoples during the war, looked towards our country as the aspiration and inspiration of all other peoples. I remember what a marvelous thing it was to be an American soldier. Our unit hit the beach at Fadala, south of Casablanca in Morocco, and we rushed ashore with our chocolate bars and our chewing gum and our talk of freedom. And the people rushed to embrace all three. In that order, I must confess. But it's a lot easier to talk about freedom after you've eaten the chocolate bar and an empty stomach than before. When the Japanese were defeated, there was no law and order left in Vietnam. Vietnam had been part of the colony of Indochina. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French had collaborated with Hitler and Tojo. The Japanese had finally taken over from the French in March of 1945, so that finally when they were defeated, there was nothing left. At last the colonial structure had been broken, and Ho Chi Minh and his people went to Hanoi and proclaimed that they were now free and independent. And he offered to his people a Declaration of Independence. Let me quote to you the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence of the Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi, September the 2nd, 1945. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yes, Ho Chi Minh, the communist, had translated our Declaration of Independence and offered it as a birthright to his people. And I, a naive young American, was thrilled. Of course, the older men who were much smarter than I said to me, don't be sucked in, Shoenbrun. It's a cunning communist ploy, a play for our sympathy. Well, maybe they were right. What a nice ploy it is. If you want to play for my sympathy by translating the document upon which my beloved nation is founded, well, come ploy with me. It's a lot better than translating Marx or Lenin or Engels or anybody else for an American. He held out his hand to us, but we didn't take it. Why didn't we take it? Well, the man who had been faithful to our anti-colonial traditions Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had died. He was replaced by Harry Truman, who was new and inexperienced in foreign affairs, and who had a very real and frightening problem before him. The emergence upon the scene of the mighty army of the Soviet Union triumphant over Germany. The Soviet Union, which had swallowed up a large part of Europe, which was beginning to penetrate into Greece and into Turkey, we thought. The threat of communist subversion in Western Europe, where in France and Italy the major political parties were communist. A fear gripped Mr. Truman and many of us, and he decided we had to build a wall against communism and help the countries of Western Europe rebuild their shattered economies and make viable democracy, which was right and which was proper, which was a well-conceived and well-executed plan. However, in order to do so, we felt we should not interfere with the French in other areas of the world in order to maintain the alliance. And so we kept hands off of Indochina and the French plans to reinstate their colony. That is where the war started to begin. That is where we made our first error, by keeping hands off and thinking that by supporting an anti-communist coalition, we would achieve our purposes. Our country used to be anti-colonial. It became merely anti-communist, and that is not good enough for the United States of America. Our country should project the best of what it has and not just negative fears. That is where the first era, which began a series of errors, all started. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed his Declaration of Independence, but he had very serious problems. His country had been wrecked by war. The dikes above Hanoi had broken. In March of 1945, 1 million people died in the flash floods and 1 million more by famine thereafter. He had a ragged little bunch of guerrillas who came out of the hills. They needed help from a highly industrialized nation. Washington wouldn't help them. We wouldn't interfere with the French. They had to turn to the French. The French had every reason to make a deal with Ho, for they wished to maintain at least some kind of influence in the former colony. The trade pattern, the economic pattern, the cultural pattern ran for 100 years from Vietnam to France. All of the educated leaders of Vietnam were educated by the French and spoke French. And so Ho Chi Minh began a series of meetings with the French to work out a new relationship between the former colony and the ex-motherland. And the French proposed the creation of a kind of a commonwealth. They called it l'Union Française, the French Union. A round, resonant, empty, which is the way the French like to conduct their foreign affairs. And they promised Ho Chi Minh that in this new union, they would work out a new relationship as they wrote their constitution. See, the French didn't have a constitution themselves in 46, and Ho was a little nervous about this. He knew French history. He knew that since 1789, the French have had 102 constitutions. Matter of fact, in Paris bookstores, constitutions are filed under the category of periodic literature. But Ho had no choice but to work out an arrangement, and he did. And now I ask you, my fellow Americans, to note this date and to note the terms of the agreement. March the 6th, 1946. An agreement was signed, which is a very important document in the history of the case. It was signed by Jean Saint-Denis, acting for the Republic of France, which recognized, and I quote, the Republic of Vietnam, a free state with its own parliament, its own defenses, its own finances. This is the first document that proved the legitimacy of Ho Chi Minh as the leader of the country, Vietnam. Not North Vietnam or South Vietnam. South Vietnam is a fiction invented later by the Department of State after a number of cruel and treacherous acts which occurred during this period of time. They recognized Ho. Ho was elected by his people, and the emperor, who represented tradition, Bao Dai, abdicated his throne, took his birth name, Citizen Vinh Thuy, and joined Ho Chi Minh as Supreme Counselor to the Republic of Vietnam. The record is very clear. I recommend that you read this document. You can find it in an excellent reference book which every American should have. It is called Vietnam, the History, the the documents and the opinions, edited by Professor Marvin Gettleman. And what is important is the documents. There you can read the Convention of 46. There you can read the Geneva Treaty and see how Mr. Rusk has falsified almost every statement he has made to you about Geneva. There you can read the CEDAW Treaty and see that the CEDAW Treaty is not a commitment to go to the aid of South Vietnam. You can judge the facts of the case if you know these documents, and I urge you to do so. Now, this first document occurred during this very important period of time. Now, the French said, we recognize your authority down to the 16th parallel. Below that, we will hold referenda to get the decision of the people. That was the first, but not the last time, that the Western world, speaking for democracy, offered to hold elections in Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh, the communist, agreed. But the elections were never held. Not then, nor later, when we violated the Geneva Treaty. The reason the French were trying to hold off in the South is that they thought they could keep it as a colony of their own. They couldn't challenge Ho in the North any longer. He already won. They'd already had a terrible experience, because after World War II, when the Japanese collapsed, occupying troops were sent to Vietnam. The Allies sent the Chinese to occupy the North. The Chinese, the traditional enemies of Vietnam. The Vietnamese have fought the Chinese for more than 1,000 years. From the Han Dynasty of 111 BC to the time of King Go Quyen, who defeated the Chinese in 939, and then the Mongols defeated China and came into Vietnam under Kublai Khan, and the Vietnamese defeated Kublai Khan. And then, a few years later, probably for the Late Show reruns, they defeated the armies of the son of Kublai Khan. They've been fighting for a very long time. But yet we sent the Chinese in to occupy the northern part of the country, and the British occupied the southern part. And the British were told, disarm the Japanese. Do not interfere in the affairs of the country. Do you know what Major General Douglas Gracie did? And you'll find the documents in that same Gettleman book. Instead of disarming the Japanese, he rearmed the Japanese to drive Ho Chi Minh's people out of Saigon. And General Douglas MacArthur, no tinko he, our Supreme Commander in Tokyo, said, and I quote, "It makes my blood boil to see us using Japanese enemy troops to put down these little people to whom we promised liberation and freedom," unquote. General Douglas MacArthur. And you'll find that quote in the Republican Party Policy Committee white paper published by the Senate. If only Dirksen could read. So Ho Chi Minh had every reason to make a deal with the French as fast as he could to try to get them out. The French, as I said, had their reasons, so they did, and they invited President Ho Chi Minh to come to Paris as their honored guest to work out the terms of a new union. That's where I first met Ho in June of 46. The conference went very badly. The French said, we are the strongest nation, so we will be in charge of the armies, and we'll occupy your country to defend you and to protect you. Those words sound familiar? They said, we're the richest country, so we'll be in charge of economics, customs, and immigration for the Commonwealth. We're the most experienced country, so we'll be in charge of diplomacy. Your diplomats can be inside our embassy. Ho Chi Minh came out of a meeting one day very bitterly and said to us, well, gentlemen, I've made some progress. They've agreed to let me have sole responsibility for the street cleaning detail in Hanoi. He predicted that war would break out. I asked him, just how do you think you're going to be able to fight the modern army of France? And he said, I'm going to do it the way George Washington and his wretched little band of guerrillas fought the great army of Britain with its Hessian mercenaries. And I said, well, President Ho, that was the 18th century. I'm not sure that can be done in the 20th century against the great new weapons of destruction. And Ho said, Mr. Shoenbrun, you will discover that in the 20th century, man's love of freedom, man's love of nation is greater than it ever was before, and no weapon ever devised by man will put down a man who's willing to fight for freedom. I didn't believe him. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed that I, a free American raised in our democratic republic, had to learn this lesson from an Oriental communist who has proved for over 20 years how a brave people is willing to fight and die for its freedom. Ho said to me, and I'm going to tell you how the war is going to be fought. Now remember, this was September 1946 that I had this interview with Ho. The war had not yet broken out. And this is what he said. It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If ever the tiger of Indochina is caught out in the open by the elephant of France, it'll be pierced by his mighty tusks, trampled underfoot, but we won't be caught. We will lurk in our forests, in our paddies, in our jungles by day, steal out by night, leap upon the back of the elephant, gouge huge chunks out of his hide, and slowly, bleeding, the elephant of France will sink into the pit of my country. That is how the war was fought after it broke out. When did it break out? Where did it break out? For what reasons? Well, it broke out in a place that Americans had never heard of then, but hear too much about now, Haiphong Harbor. Remember I said the French said that they were going to be in charge of economics, customs, and immigration? Well, they sent their customs officer to take over the harbor. And Ho Chi Minh's people said, look here, you've recognized us by treaty as a free state. We're in charge of our harbor. And the French said, get along, little boy, we're taking over. And there was a scuffle and 2 Frenchmen were killed. Do you know what the French did? The country of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the cradle of white Western Christian civilization. They lined up 4 capital ships in front of the open and defenseless port of Haiphong, began a 4-hour cannonading, which, according to the admiral in charge of the French fleet, killed 8,000 people in one afternoon. I saw the archives. It's in my book, As France Goes. More details can be found in a magnificent book that I recommend to all of you. Not only the documents and the record, but beautifully written by a great American historian, Ellen J. Hammer, a book called The Struggle for Indochina, Stanford University Press. It's a textbook in my class at Columbia, and I recommend it to all of you today, students, faculty, and businessmen alike. The tiger of Indochina struck back in December. The war began. That is the way the war was fought. Year after year I went to Indochina and watched the tiger leap upon the back of the elephant until, as Ho predicted, the elephant of France sunk into the pit of Dien Bien Phu. I was there and watched it happen. Now I know why McNamara has told the Senate that our bombing couldn't stop the infiltration. I know why, because I drove out of Hanoi down route number 1, called the Route Mandarine at the time of the French. I watched our planes come and drop bombs and blow that road up. And we were crouching in a bamboo forest 150 miles off the road with all the Vietnamese. And when our planes left and that road was torn to pieces, I watched the Vietnamese come out. Not with trucks, not with trains, which is what we need as a big industrial society, but they are a peasant society. They came out with things strapped to their backs and with bicycles. I've never seen anything like it. On the back wheel of the bicycle, a wooden plank. On each end of the plank, a straw basket. 50 pounds in each basket. 100 pounds per bicycle. 20 bicycles. 1 ton. 500 bicycles can provide all that their armies need in the South. And they have 400,000 bicycles moving throughout that country. It's like trying to fight a swarm of mosquitoes with a sledgehammer. Doesn't work. And then they said to me, Mr. Shoenbrun, come down to the river. Would you like to cross it without a bridge? I said, well, haven't walked on water lately, but one of my forebears did. And I'll give it a try. I'll give it a try. So they brought me down to the river, and they blew a whistle. And out of the rushes came 6 flat-bottomed boats, sampans. They lined them up. They lashed them together with palmetto leaves. They overlaid a planking of logs. And I watched 5-ton trucks come down and cross that bridge. Plus, of course, all the bicycles.